It now gives me great pleasure to introduce James Brown. Sorry, whenever I say that, I think you're going to break out into song. It's a Māori's world, something like that. James Brown, no Ngāi Tai Ki Tāmaki. I think in the Māori world, James Brown would need no introduction, neither the singer nor the Ngāi Tāmaki variety. As several of you know, there are over 40 statutes that make reference to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, some of those, like the Education Act 1989, require universities to acknowledge the principles. Others, like the RMA, require regional councils, for example, to take the principles into account. But the strongest formulation we have, or the reference there is to the principles, occurs in the Conservation Act 1987, where that legislation is to be read and acted upon in a way that gives effect to the principles of the treaty. Tiffany likes to point out that the department has spent the last 30 plus years figuring out how to get around that and doing quite a good job of it, until in walks James Brown. So he's going to talk to us through the experience of Ngāi Tai Ki Tāmaki, how they have read and responded to the department's reading in response to Section 4 of the Conservation Act. Without any further delay, it gives me great pleasure to call on James Brown.
Tēnā koutou. This morning at breakfast, I was thinking about the program. I thought, geez, 2:30 after kai, tēnō reke o te kai. Pāna ki tā ahuatanga, e hia moi ne. So I was thinking, we're going to sing Tūturu Mai Ngā Iwi, so we can keep our people alive and awake and stimulated about this kōrero. So it's very, very humbling and privileged to receive the tono to come down to Awarua and to share, I guess, initially our journey, but in the end, our shared journey, as it was in the start. And so that's the overview. And then this particular case for us, not without the earlier work of Ngāi Tahu in the Wales case of Kai Koura, and with or without your knowledge or support, those of us in the motu had been relying on that post the decision, no matter what it said, right? Because this is the highest ground that Section 4 had received until we had entered this particular case. But this comment came from our uncle Wiremu. It's actually, that's his real name, but that's not what we call him in Rāpaki. His actual name is Uncle Nigger. But when you write it on a PowerPoint, it just don't look good. Because he had real issues about his real name being on a PowerPoint. He was very clear about what his name is. But thankfully we got him over the line. But his name is Wiremu Makiwhara. But that's what he said, not without the whāriki that Ngāi Tahu weaved for us to sit on later. Mihi nunui, kia koutou e Ngāi Tahu. It's like a delay, is it? Yep, so we're a small iwi. I've got to stand out here if I may, because I can't see the screen. Yeah, so we say we've got ancient and historical interests to Tāmaki Makaurau. I've got it here. Yep. And so I said earlier in the pai today about Ngāi Tai Ki Tāmaki. It's all right. Ngāi Tai Ki Tāmaki, Ngāi Tai Ki Mahurangi, Ngāi Tai Ki Hauraki, Ngāi Tai Ki Waikato, Ngāi Tai Ki Te Manukunuku Hoturoa, Ngāi Tai Ki Tōrere. And it's pretty much summed up at the bottom there. So we're part of the 95 Waikato Raupatu settlement. We're one of the 63 marae hapu iwi. We're also one of the 13 of the Ngā Mana Whenui Tāmaki Makaurau settlement in 2014. We then consequently got our own settlement in 2018, and we're also part of the pending Hauraki settlement where we're one of 12 tribes. So terms of te tiriti, in our takiwā, similar to yourselves, I was just making sure that we're where we need to be. There is a saying in Ngāi Tai about who we are, what describes us, and in Pākehā what it says is they are seafaring people with no sense of boundaries and they're only encumbered by their imagination. To a fella like me, when I grow up being told this every day by my elders, at the age of 6, I went home one day at 9 o'clock when the bell was ringing, and my nan said to me, "What are you doing at home?" And I said, "I'm expressing my imagination." And believe it or not, that paid off for my schooling years, because I was normally home before 12 o'clock on most days. I didn't actually read or write English till I turned 32. I have many thanks to give Australia, because I didn't learn that here. Section 4 is a provision of fundamental importance in the exercise by DOC of its powers and its responsibilities. The effective sidelining of Section 4 and the decisions under challenge in circumstances where the Ngāi Tai Trust's interest was based on its mana whenua in relation to the motu was a failure to comply with this fundamental important requirement. It was therefore an error of some consequence. Now, I think for those of us that are familiar with legal terminology, it's actually quite a powerful outcome from the court. And the reason why, in our case, when I get to background very quickly, is that when we first launched the judicial review and we went to the High Court, Justice Fogarty said there was an error of law that was committed. However, the department upheld its decision-making responsibilities, if you were, albeit that there was an error around the treaty. I mean, that's like a dollar each way decision. And it left not just Ngāi Tai, but I think it left the legal fraternity in a bit of a dilemma about what do you do with this decision. And in the respondents' case, they were clapping their hands because it was a win for them. And of course we appealed. And then we went through that process, and I've been listening to some of the kōrero today around some great legal folk that have represented us over many, many decades. And in our case at the appeal court, we had a QC and we had a sharpshooter and we had our own resident lawyers. We were convinced by our resident lawyers that the QCs were really going to do the business for us. We walked out of the appeal court and got a real good hiding. We hadn't even reached the bottom of the steps of that court, and we had terminated QCs and everyone else without the decision, because it was inevitable. We knew what was coming. And you know, when you're delivering something and those things, and in our case, unfortunately, our legal counsel was struggling to pronounce our name correctly all day. So a critical error on our part around our representation. But I will say this, it was probably a masterstroke insofar as our application to the Supreme Court strongly opposed by the respondents. Thankfully, the courts allowed to hear us. And then, of course, Ngāi Tahu made contact with us, Arihia, and Lisa and the team, Matapuri and Tātipani, about joining the case. And of course, very humbled and honoured to get this tunnel. But as I said earlier, for some 20 years, you know, we'd been using your case without your knowledge. So it was the least we could do was absolutely assure you that there was always a place for Ngāi Tahu in this. We don't look at this as Ngāi Tai leading anything really. We just looked at this around the help we needed to strengthen the position that we were in. The mere fact that we managed to get an approval to go there, we need to make sure that whatever we went with was our A game. And I'm not saying Ngāi Tai going alone wouldn't have taken an A game, but I'm not convinced I'd be standing before you if we didn't go together. So thank you, because without you, the strength of our position could have been lingering for some further action by someone else. But generally what happened in the background about our case was the the department, Eugenie. It's great to see you. Eugenie inherited this. I mentioned on the pipi this morning. We filed when Maggie Barry was the minister, and of course Eugenie came in at a later point and inherited the good, bad and the ugly around the army of Te Papa Atawhai and its many, many challenges. So it's great to have you here, Eugenie, because we haven't seen each other for a little while. And one of the great things about Eugenie was there were some peripheral matters going on as well, which she's aware of, and some of them were public. For example, we had a concessionaire that was on Motatapu Island that was farming Auckland's biggest farm. 49 cows died on Boxing Day of 2018. They were buried in our midden site discreetly. An attempt to conceal them was deliberate by the farmer, and of course we had no choice but to prosecute under the Heritage Act that particular action, of which DOC also were part of that prosecution. But the great thing about Eugenie in that period was, in the period of allegations before we even had a decision, I think Eugenie got called out one day with all the journalists and the cameras and microphones. She was asked about the cows, and without the decision, she apologised to us on TV and expressed that publicly. And for our iwi, it went a long way towards building our appetite back up around our shared ability to reconcile and to communicate, because in the communications were the solutions. Previous to that, we weren't really talking, and when we were, it was more around litigation than anything else. So in our case, what happened was the department recategorised some of their iconic and our iconic landscapes, particularly Peretu, and I heard Taua Moana referring and reciting our rohe this morning, using the name Rangi Toto. However, the real name is Peretu. When we spoke with the Crown and settlement negotiations about the origins of the name Rangi Toto, no one knows. 180,000 punters used to go there pre-COVID to this place, and it can vary, right? Rangi, Ranga, and if you're really lucky, Rangi Toto. These are the reo that you hear on the ferries. So under Section 4, our view was the Crown had an active responsibility to actively protect Te Mito o Mātou reo. Hey, we're not saying the names right. All these punters that were going to these places were actually going, may as well go to Disneyland, bro, because there's no such place called Rangi Toto. We'll accept Rangi Toto, but those things, and you can catch the ferry today, you're still going to hear this today. When they recategorised Peretu, or Rangi Toto and Motatapu, they were quantified as manaaki trails. With their own laws about to operate there commercially, you had to be qual marked. Ngāi Tai invested in all of these little steps along the way. We also agreed with the department that we would open up the doors and share with the stakeholders what our moi moi would be. So we spent 6 months allowing them in the room, listening to the kōrero. We made an application successfully to do guided walks to Ngā Puna Toru o Peretu, or the 3 knuckles of Peretu, which is the summit of Rangi Toto. Within 6 months of our approval, there were 2 similar approvals that followed us. One for a charitable group there to ecologically restore the island, known as the Motatapu Restoration Trust, and the other being Fuller's. Both weren't qual marked. Both hadn't in any way, shape and form invested in, if you were, the sub-rules of operating commercially in a manaaki trail. Only 4 manaaki trails in Aotearoa, only 1 in Tāmaki, and that is Peretu and Motatapu. And so for us it was pretty amusing that within 6 months of our concession we've got similar concessions occurring, of which we opposed, and that was the genesis of the judicial review. And so when we think about the affidavits of the respondents, we read things like we have 30,000 registered volunteers that have expended $70 million worth of labour in their hours to weed and plant. Without our work, Ngāi Tai wouldn't be able to access and express their cultural identity, their customs, rituals, and other protocols without us. Really? Let's go test that. And so that's the genesis, the backbone around why we've taken this case. It was, we'd actually inadvertently harboured competitors in the same room with our own moi moia, that they just changed the names because they're arguably the same documents. And so look, that's the backbone to it. This slide here is more around the mana of why mana whenua, tangata whenua is so important, at least in Tāmaki, around this case. And so this is the timeline of how things happened. In 2015 is when the sharing of knowledge was occurring. 2016 we lodged the judicial review. In 2017 we went through the Court of Appeal process. Then in 2018 we had the case and the decision, which happened on 15th of December of 2018. And I remember getting a call from Dr. Ronnie Cooper at that time working for Ngāi Tahu, telling me where she was. The decision had just popped up on stuff, and she apologised while she was talking to me, and I said, why are you apologising? She wasn't apologising to me, she was apologising to the people she was sitting with, because she was so euphoric about the decision. And so it was care of that call that we were, oh Jesus, decision's out. And again, I do honour Eugenie here, because the decision, although critical for us, is still a critical decision for Department of Conservation. And Eugenie, you should know, in history, in 100 years, it'll be your name that'll be associated to this case, insofar as the outcomes. Won't be James Brown's name. The statement that there's no basis for preferential entitlement to concessions cannot be reconciled with the Wales case. Similarly, the statement that economic benefit to an iwi with mana whenua cannot be taken into account failed to recognise the active protection principle of the treaty. Now, I know it's ambiguous, right? Active protection. In the Ngāi Tai Nation, it means active protection of everything Ngāi Tai wants to imagine, because that's its only encumbrance. So the threshold's pretty high, not just for the department, but every ministry council that we deal with. I know the court couldn't address, as does Tā Tipani and others, directly the Ngāi Tahu failure of the courts at that time. And in this decision, they've attempted, in our view, to acknowledge and honour that error in the same decision. And so in our particular journey together, our legal counsels had a pretty clear-cut strategy. Grant Illingworth, learned colleague and also a friend of ours, QC, represented yourselves with Paul Beverley. We had Jamie Ferguson from Kahui Law, who had been to the Supreme Court 4 times before we met him. He'd never won. And when we met him, we go, oh, we want you to be our lawyer, because I've been there 4 times, I've never won. I said, well, that's funny. I went to the appeal court with the QC. He told me I was going to walk out the door a champion. We're not going to get any worse than what we feel about what happened there. Thankfully, Jamie agreed to take the case. But between us, not a deliberate thing of sorts, but I always look at Ngāi Tahu, they got class, eh? They got class. Yeah, Ngāi Tai is going to get class one day, but yeah, we like the trenches. We're born in the trenches. And so our presence was taking the case into the trenches. Your presence was lifting the case to Mars to land on the moon. And so we did. And they needed each other, like we needed each other. We had to allocate, I think it was a week for hearings at that time. It only had one day. In fact, it didn't even go the whole day. Our view by coming out on the first day was we thought we had a real good shot. I'll share with you some of the reasons why there was. We acknowledge that Section 4 does not exist in a vacuum, and a number of other factors must be taken into account in making a decision on a concession application. But Section 4 should not be seen as being trumped by other considerations. Nor should Section 4 merely be part of an exercise balancing it against the other relevant considerations. What is required is a process under which the meeting of other statutory or non-statutory objectives is achieved, to the extent that this can be done consistently with Section 4 in a way that best gives effect to the relevant treaty principles. For us, this is quite a strong outcome in Tāmaki Makaurau, because what happened here in this iconic landscape of these islands, it is immersed in many, many other statutes and other law. The Hauraki Gulf Forum, the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act. So these things were constantly brought in by Crown law as these things take precedence, not Section 4. And so for us it was like, oh really? So those of us that know Section 4 comparably to, say, Local Government Act or Resource Management Act shall have regard, yet in the Conservation Act shall give effect. Two compelling but extremely different mechanisms and tools for us to explore to realise things like our rangatiratanga, for example, our kawanatanga, our kaitiakitanga responsibilities ki Ngāi Tahu. Not how DOC or anyone else council want to tell us how to do it, but what's in our DNA that we know how to do it. And so it acknowledged Ngāi Tai's mana whenua on the islands as a basis for their opposition relevant to the application of Section 4. Section 4 is a powerful treaty clause requiring more than just procedural steps, may require a substantive outcome for iwi, should not be trumped by other considerations, nor should it should not simply be part of a general balancing exercise. This slide really is a general analysis, if you were, at that time of 30 years of the DOC culture. Right? I know there's some DOC people here. I know that, I don't know how long you've been there. It's not meant for you personally. It's actually, for us, a fact of the matter. DNA had set in, so much so that every day when the decisions were made, Section 4, which was about to alarm you, was actually never considered. Section 4 requires a consideration of whether there should be a preference for iwi in order to give effect to treaty principles. In some instances, that might mean no concession can be granted. For those that followed the case in the media, you'll remember the terms of iwi want veto. Iwi want everything. Well, actually, no. We just actually wanted to understand what this law really meant. If this is a byproduct of it, oh, well, it's a byproduct of it. We still want to know the origins and the integrity of what was meant when this law was written. As far as possible, DOC must apply all relevant laws in a manner that gives effect to the relevant principles of the treaty. Therefore, the Conservation General Policy is wrong when it says that where legislation and treaty principles conflict, the legislation prevails. The same applies to the General Policy for National Parks. And what it really is talking about is our experience in the court. So in the High Court, Crown Law spent over 3 hours, close to 4, debating with Justice Fogarty that when give effect was written in Section 4, it wasn't actually meant. Okay? So Justice Fogarty, to his credit, wanted to explore this. So we left the court. Crown Law didn't change course. It held its ground. It didn't mean this. Justice Fogarty, on one occasion, says, but it's written, word for word. This is what it says. So it's surely what it means. No, it doesn't, Your Honour. No, it doesn't. We left the court pretty confused about the written word not really meaning anything in the very place that it's supposed to have a home in. This comes back again to bite Crown law when we were all together in the Supreme Court. Decision makers' dismissal of the possibility of preference being accorded to an iwi with mana whenua over the land to which the challenged decisions related and of the economic benefit that could accrue to such an iwi be taken into account meant she did not give proper consideration to those possibilities as Section 4 required her to do so. So in our case, we were simply saying these competitors cannot compete with us based on many things, but including things like the protection aspect of the principles of the treaty. How are we being protected? How is Crown actively looking to protect us, including but not restricted to just business? Things like our reo, things like our treaty partnership, things like goodwill that we'd subscribed to enter into the negotiations. Okay, here, where's it gone? DOC's focus went direct to the wider national response, partial review of the conservation general policy for national parks. This was occurring in parallel. Proposed changes to be decided on by mid-2022 following development recommendation and public consultation. I appreciate that this stuff is out in the motu at the moment. Improved engagement on the ground, but processes remain the same. As a result, Ngāi Tahu continue to hold DOC accountable for continued breaches of Section 4. And sadly, I will share with you in here, as I did in Rapaki a few months ago, breaches are still occurring. In reconsidering its decisions, DOC will be required to consider whether, despite the fact that there is no issue of overcapacity or risk of environmental degradation of the motu from the operation of the proposed concessions, nevertheless, the correct outcome is to decline to grant the concession applications given the requirements of Section 4. So the Supreme Court agreed with our position that these two other applications should have been declined based on, one, this but other parts of the decision that they refer to. And of course, this is the decision, right? As we were leading into the decision, we're like, where are we going with this? And then we have the reconsideration aspects of the decision and the process whereby DOC reconsideration of the concession decisions only needed this was only completed in November last year. The decision was in December 2018. So we've had 2 years of, with respect, the department trying to figure stuff out, but nonetheless stuck in a state of flux, really. Although the Motatapu Restoration Application Trust was terminated immediately by the courts, the fullest licence ran its full life, right, to November of last year. So we didn't even get to reconsider it. It ran its life. And then, of course, they did contact us in October. How do you guys feel about us reapplying? Oh, yeah, fill your boots, Johnny. We'll see you again. So they haven't, and they've actually withdrawn from the island in terms of the operation. They're still the ferry provider there. That wasn't really our issue. Our issue was what the activities we're doing on there. These are our ancestral landscapes. So they've, if you were, observed the decision, albeit that they managed to run the life on their reconsideration space. So now we've received the final DOC report rejecting and declining these applications. We got that 2 months ago. And it relies heavily, obviously, on the Supreme Court decision. So the reconvening aspects of the decisions are now finished. What are the learnings? Highlighted the importance of ensuring settlement redress consistent with Section 4 and does not undermine it. And that's quite a critical point for iwi that are still negotiating. There are some iwi that heard about the case got a hold of us, came and saw us. I won't name them, some of them are quite significant, decided that they'll wait for the decision. So they suspended negotiations with the Crown. As soon as the decision came out, a handful that were waiting have been really enthusiastic ever since. So for those of us that were working with and have met with people like the Tūhoi settlement, the language within that and the integrity of that is something that I'm sure we all aspire towards in terms of us in Tāmaki Makaurau, but independently we just couldn't get that sort of settlement struck with the Crown because of Tāmaki's complex layers of shared interest, for example, as one of a number of elements. But it did highlight the need to produce comprehensive and considered responses to DOC on all key matters, or matters that you believe are key, and I know you guys are big leaders for all of us, even at the moment, around the stock space, and decide when to challenge and on what basis. And look, you've heard me talk this morning about, can we join your water case? But it's the same thing. We're all on a pendulum about how much or less investment we want to make, albeit we might share the same frustration and challenges. But nonetheless, our piggy bank is nowhere near the size of yours, so at the moment we're going to continue to enjoy yours, albeit in the grandstand as a spectator. I did say to Te Maire though, oh look, tū mai tū atu, eh? I said, you have one, we'll have one, you have one, we'll have one. So look, see how you go, Te Maire, you get to the last round, knock knock. And just, yeah, subsequent matters. Unfortunately, within 6 months of the 2018 decision, there was a transaction, a commercial one that occurred in Auckland. It was a private transfer and acquisition of what was known as Auckland Whale and Dolphin Watch. It was bought by Great Sites, who were operating out of the Bay of Islands. Great Sites have buses, now they've got whale watching in Tāmaki Makaurau. We had an issue about that. We felt that that was a public process, and at a minimum, we felt we needed to be engaged with under Section 4, given the decision. DOC now admit that they got that wrong, but at the time there was confusion over commercially sensitive. You know that redaction? It's commercially sensitive. So no. Well, you hold on to commercial sensitivity, bro, because Section 4 says you have a legal responsibility to actively protect us. And this is within 6 months of the decision. I did say at Rapaki, and I have to say today, we chose to mitigate an outcome around that matter as opposed to continued litigation. And the reason we chose to mitigate was the same old thing, is like pick your fights and pick them wisely, especially if you've got an empty purse like us. So we mitigated that, and I'll come back to this in a second about how things, if they're not dealt with properly, can continue to manifest, and one day wake up the Ngāi Tai Nation and go, okay, hopo, enough's enough, we're going back. So the heritage offences we've had, I've touched on. I've spoken about a 30-year DNA. We have just applied for our own whale and dolphin watch application. We lodged that on the 5th of October last year. In Tāmaki, you're only allowed, well, there are two. One had expired in August, and that was the one we were after. I got an email on the 22nd of December telling me that, oops, we've only just picked it up. Oh, and by the way, the office closes tomorrow. And we're back on the 18th of June. So they went to Christmas and came back to the Ngāi Tai Nation's email, Merry Christmas. Did you enjoy it? Because we're now in dialogue with your legal counsel over continued dismissive attitude that I said earlier is this DNA of 30 years. And any one of us expecting the department to change colours today you know, we are a little bit deluded in that hope. This is just but the first of many steps that need to be, or the second, sorry, of many steps that need to be taken for our kids. Right, this journey not over at all. It's really just beginning. And so we've had this subsequent matter over the Wales issue. And in the bottom there, and look, Awarua have this, anybody that wants to talk to the Haukainga, and I'm sure they'll share it with you because it's yours. Is a business as usual. Now, I acknowledge Mike mihi atu kia koe. And look, as Lou often says to me, it's a big ship, James. It's going to take time to turn. I accept that. I do. Until I, as Ngāi Tai Ki Tāmaki, put an application in front of you. We're not asking you, we're telling you. And so there's been some subsequent issues that have caused for us to keep sharp over DNA things. That includes ourselves, right? We've got to improve us too, not just always about the department. What have we done wrong? How do we improve? Because that must strengthen our relationship. But we've done some good things. One of the first things that happened was Eugenie coming to Motutapu Island, and we signed our treaty relationship agreement that is just unique between the department and Ngāi Tai Ki Tāmaki. Same as I imagine the Ngāi Tahu and the department's relationship. It's our korowai of how we have agreed, notwithstanding the court process and the intention of law, but how we've agreed to work together on the ground. And initially, we had great momentum. But I will say, as Mike knows, we've still got more challenges in front of us. Our momentum's not going, if you were, as well as Ngāi Tai would like, and I'm sure as well as Mike wants and others. But we've still got lots of work to do to move this ship in the direction that our kids need it moving, so that when their hand is on the rudder, tika pono me te aroha. Not this hautatu stuff around the back door. Path ahead. What extent do we continue to engage with DOC and its processes? DOC have engaged a national options working group who are tasked with addressing the decision around the motu. It has great people on this group. We hosted the first wānanga Rumapuia Marae. We had Ngāi Tahu there, who we had tono to observe. And at our purupuraki of that, DOC asked could they come back to Rumapuia to hand over the final draft, parallel with it going to Lou and up to the Minister for comment. And of course we said yes, but when our tohunga got up to do the karakia, he decided, oh no, when did you fellas go to Rapaki? Oh yeah, the other month. Oh, we go to take the purupuraki to Rapaki because I couldn't come. So next minute I'm being tasked with, oh, we're going to send a tono to Rapaki Marae to see if they want to host the last two, and the night I'll come down there and get the draft. And so we're waiting for ngā whānau pānui back as to ai o kao. So we understand we still all have issues. Nothing like being unwelcomed after you've been welcomed. At least that's what happens in my marae. So we did observe the 2 days with this group. I have a degree of encouragement about what they're tasked with, but I have more concern about what we're going to be fed in terms of this draft. It's a tough one, right? It really is. They're really tasked with a challenge, but he Māori, kia kaha rāta, mahi ata mai. So how do we continue to engage and work together on this? And Ara here, thank you. There's many things that your people have shared with mine around the mechanical grunt that is the dock corridors, and so you've been sharing your stuff with our team, which has made our stuff with such a limited resource a lot more fluid, a lot more transparent for our people to understand. which has obviously strengthened their mamae about none of us keep going back to court. And so those things, you know, coming today was really for us just an ongoing of our whanaungatanga that's been established through this and other ways. Do we need greater comment? Oh, sorry. No, wānanga and iwi exchanges are critical to share intelligence experience, both good, bad. So we've had each other right through the course of the decision, where we've had your people up at Motatapu and our marae on a number of occasions. You've been able to observe our growth, progress, if there has been any, in your own way, right? And you've been able to come home, and consequently we too have been invited by you to come and share and whanaunga with each other about our shared issues. So those things for us are probably the greatest outcome for us, is our whanaungatanga and the strength of it growing. And meeting Estelle, for example, this morning on the Pai. Estelle and I are digital connections, eh? So you'll remember a number of short years ago, we had an unfortunate incident at Motatapu to do with 4 takehe being murdered by dock contractors, and then a deliberate attempt to conceal the murder by throwing them in the tidal mangroves. Thankfully, one of them had a transmitter on its waiwai. These 4 were resident birds of the senior ranger of dock, who was away at the time when this happened, and when he returned, on the 3rd day he rings me, I can't find my boots. What do you mean you can't find you? I can't find my boots. Well, hangs the phone up. Sadly, we all know what happened. I saw Merv and had a good chat with him earlier, who was here. Merv was on the point of that arrow around what had happened. And I will say this, around meeting Estelle today was the first time we've met face to face. But our whanaungatanga until today is pretty intense, you know. Hey, Estelle, can I have some more manu? Hear me? Your kaitiakitanga is a bit questionable, you know. And so, you know, to meet the whanaungatanga aspects in terms of the decision and its outcomes are immeasurable, immeasurable. And they'll last forever. They'll last forever. Do we need greater comment from the courts? I don't know. At home, it's a natural response. Of course we do. Of course we do. So again, acknowledging te tai hauru, o te waipanamu, e roto e te mama e te puare e te papaata whai nei, pata mai nei e te kōrero e roto e te kōti tuatoru ni. Hey, so off we go again, around section 4 or about the board stuff being dismissed. There are many kōrero in te ika Māui about, I wouldn't say monthly, but every 2 or 3 months we'll host a hapu and iwi from the motu. We're told it's about this particular tikanga. We're no sooner talking about our whanaungatanga, and then we're getting hit with, actually, we've come because we think we've got a Section 4 case. Oh. And so I recall the earlier days of Paul Beverley representing yourselves when we lodged at the High Court. He rang us and said, look, I'll keep an eye on this case because I'm keen to see how it goes on behalf of Ngāi Tahu. He'd missed the dial at the appeal, and of course he was pretty apologetic when he rang in the space of the Supreme Court. But that aside, Paul would agree that there's certainly room for more discovery, but whoever chooses to take that will enjoy our support naturally, if it isn't us, dare I say it, because when we did the porphyry of the Options Working Group, it was a great couple of days. We spoke about Ngāi Tahu needing to be present when the final draft arrives, regardless of where it's hosted our view is we should be there because this draft is being designed and developed in lieu of the work that you have done and we have added to that others are still to come, right? And so whatever it is that they give us, it's still a draft. And I wouldn't cross your T's and dot your I's on it, just say it's a draft. If we think we can do something with it, then we will. If we can't, then we won't apologise for what we'll do with the draft, I'm sure. And so, yes, we put a tono out about who would host the last hui, and that we should both be there to receive it. And the Options Working Group certainly want us there if we're available so that we can receive it. And so they're keen to do that with us if we're available, and we'll just await your response as to a yes or no, whether we're coming to Waipanamu or whether you're coming to Tāmaki Makaurau. Just a couple of side notes around being with you today is the department at home have really endeavoured. Eugenie, I want you to know that the Tāmaki team have regathered well. Sadly though, the disconnection, Mike, of our head office, yes, to our local office, well, we ain't got the capex or the opex. It needs to be more pono and tika. We need to be more, you know, if you haven't got it, just tell us, but we can work with that. But we're being told and we're being encouraged that things are going to change. So I'll share this with you in the background about what would be an example of why Ngāi Tai would continue a Section 4 issue or in any other litigation with the department. On 1 January of last year, we took over the Motatapu farm. It's Auckland's biggest farm. You'd fellas call it a sheep paddock. It's only 3,000 acres. But you'll be surprised what 3,000 acres are worth in Tāmaki Makaurau right now. But it is Auckland's biggest farm. It's also Auckland's richest archaeological site. It has the largest military tunnel network in Aotearoa. It has the largest outdoor education camp in Aotearoa that's fully booked 2 years in advance. We have 300 kids there a day, run by an independent trust doing a great job. And then we have this farm. When we did diligence on the farm, and the farmer just left the day before we took it over, we got 3 independent reports, 2 Māori and 1 Pākehā, well-known operators at all export. The result is generally we need $16 to $17 million to bring the island back up to spec so that we can farm it. So we have 70% damage of over 200 kilometres of fencing, 140 kilometres of piping, 70% of that is damaged. Out of 300 troughs, only 4 are working. And Ngāi Tai has taken this beast on in this hugely deficit situation. So what we're managing now is our inherent appetite to take our taonga, our ancestral landscapes back, but do we have to pay for this 30-year presence of our predecessor who, frankly, didn't have to comply, was never audited until he left. The outcome is a current litigation of sorts that's less than $1 million between the previous farmer and the department. And this farmer didn't pay his rent for his last 2 years as well, right? And so tomorrow when I get home, I'm still in this deficit, yet I'm not going to let this go. And if we're accused of being the worst farmers in Aotearoa, well, so be it. But the reality is, sometimes really be careful what you wish for, because we are faced with a deficit, and although it's completely the Crown's responsibility and the Crown action, anyone that just relies on the Crown to fix something for you is not without you. So inevitably, we will invest as well in trying to reconcile this deficit, because we have to. We want to be good, responsible farmers. My grandfather won the Ahu Whenua. He was the last winner in Tāmaki Makaurau in 1956. Still hasn't come back to Tāmaki Makaurau. I'm not saying we're going to use a dock asset to have a go, but who knows? They might change the rules and let us. So it's a huge challenge, but it's really one that's ancestrally in our DNA that we actually need to take on, regardless of who did what, when and why. It's more about, Mike, what solutions do we have for tomorrow? That's what it's about. And so on that, that's really in a nutshell our little hikoi we've had about this kaupapa that you had laid the whāriki for us many years earlier, that we've added to, but I wouldn't suggest to us that the weaving is finished. On the contrary, I would suggest to us there are more weavers coming, because although we share similar mamai, a similar raru, they can be extremely different. I was asked during the case, or after the case, why did we win and Ngāi Tahu didn't? I haven't spoken to Tā Tipani about this. I'm actually asked this quite often. And I say to people, I don't know. I know that Ngāi Tahu's presence strengthened us. I know that our shared elements of our presentation to the courts enabled us. And we placed our tikanga, our trust in the justice system, which is there to serve us. But our islands didn't have whale tails. I remember the case. And when we first took it, oh, look, Ngāi Tahu's tried this. What's the difference between you and Ngāi Tahu? These are islands, bro, they don't move. I wake up tomorrow, that island's still got the same GPS mark. So yeah, I really do own it. Not my cousin down Ngāti Pāwa, because he moved 2 kilometres up the trench. He's still in the same place. And so I've held that ever since, about why were we different to Ngāi Tahu. And I apologise to, in measuring a taonga like our toho rā with a motu. But it's similar for us about how is it that Ngāi Tai have the mana of these islands, yet there's a marae looking straight at it in the city. Why? Oh, no, we know their interest. They open the curtains up every day and boom, there she is. Not moving it. You open it tomorrow, she's still there. And its name ain't Rangi Toto. Its name is Peretu. And we're the only ones, and that's the legislated name now of the island under Ngā Mana Whenui Tāmaki Makaurau, Peretu. And the summit, Ngā Puna Toru o Peretu, the 3 knuckles, revered because when he was born, he had 3 fingers and 3 toes, and the Pākeke placed him there without a name, that they named Peretu because they thought he was a ngāngara. He was a lizard. And he lived there by himself his whole life. So many names of Peretu around Tāmaki, and our taua moana referred to them this morning in terms of haukapua o Peretu, me te arawa waka. Te pōnui o Peretu. Te waitamata, te wai o Peretu. Everything for Ngāi Tai, Peretu, Peretu, Peretu. And that was the whakapapu of Ngāi Tai and Te Arawa with their ngāngara o kahu mata māmoe when they arrived. And so we, like you, it wasn't really about the business at all. It was actually about our whakapapu. It was about our DNA and our responsibilities to these taonga, not just for Ngāi Tai, but for Tāmaki Makaurau and Aotearoa. So on that, still more to do, hopefully by others that we can support, but if us, oh well, we've been there and we'll have a reason to go back if we go back again. On that, tēnei te kōrero o mātou i Ngāi Tai Ki konei roto i te whare, kia koutou, ki te haukainga, hei tūpoto me aku whakaaro ai ngā kōrero i te wā, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.